So my specialty is human factors engineering. So what I do is, well, maybe I'll leave my video on for this first slide. What I do is using engineering approaches to analyzing the way people interact with design processes and products, and using that knowledge in design to benefit effective and enjoyable interaction. Human-centered design is not simply common sense or a knowledge that people have automatically because we are human. Human factors is not a synonym for the thing was broken by the people. The machine is fine. And human factors or human-centered design doesn't mean focusing on defects of the person, whereby to patch over the person. The human factors approach to design is to design things to work with people as they are. It's harder for people to break something if it was tailored to fit them in the first place. So naturally, with that context, inclusion and access is often on my radar. Now, I hope that it goes without saying that even though most of you are American, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, stops at your borders. There are 195 other countries, and themed entertainment is a global business, and designers and operators are often in different countries from each other and different countries from the United States. So even within the United States, ADA compliance is not the same as accessibility. I produce and direct a university student competition for theme park design called the Toronto Metropolitan University THRILL Design Competition. And in their submission, I see students trying to emulate professionals, saying things like, this is the alternate route for ADA guests. I'm an ADA guest. As a deaf person, I'm entitled to provisions of the ADA, but I don't need an alternate route. What the alternate route is for is wheelchair users. Say that, or say something even clearer, like step-free route. Some wheelchair users might park the wheelchair and walk a short distance on a regular route, even with steps. Likewise, babies in strollers benefit from step-free routes. People with bad knees may benefit from step-free routes, even if they're not wheelchair users. A wheelchair is not a disability. It's a device used by people for multiple different reasons. ADA is not a synonym for wheelchair. It's a code. The ADA is a code that sets out the barest of bare minimum for access to various disabilities. So that was a preamble of why I'm not talking about ADA. I'm talking about accessibility and inclusion. The most familiar requirement is height. And you notice that in this slide, I blocked out the face of another guest there, but I have left the little girl's face visible because that's my own daughter and I'm legally entitled to her face. So that's about 20 some years ago, not a recent picture. So traditional height requirements are usually motivated by excluding children who might have insufficient mental and physical development to tolerate the ride action or to behave appropriately during the experience. In Europe, it's common to have age requirements. In Japan, children often go to the park wearing their school uniforms, so you could filter them based on whether they're wearing a uniform of a grade that's at the level that you require for the ride. But in North America, the minimum age is usually translated to a corresponding height. Well, anyone who's ever tried to buy clothing for children knows that if you buy clothes for somebody else's kid and you don't know their size, you can't figure it out from their age. Age and size are poorly correlated. However, in the United States, especially, operators will not trust self-reported age, and patrons will not be reliably able to present proof of their age. But everyone can always exhibit their height on any given day. So you're using height as a proxy for age, as a proxy for some level of development. Once that height requirement is determined, then some other dimensions of the rides might be based on correlated dimensions that go along with that height, except the correlation among body dimensions is very low. Height-based eligibility allows kids onto rides who are tall for their age or wearing big shoes. A thesis project I read once that reviewed media reports of rider ejections, and riders self-extracting from rides found that most of those ejections and self-extractions, they were more common among petite people rather than large people who were poorly fitted for the restraint. And this is a greater risk for kids who are tall and slender. So the ejection is not just due to ejection forces, by the way, it's also the person squirming in their seat and getting into a position where the restraint and containment system no longer holds them effectively. So excessive space within the restraint is created when you have a slender person who is tall enough. And that encourages wiggling and repositioning within that excessive amount of space, and then the restraint can't intercept the ride forces. So in that case, the height requirement unintentionally allows participation of someone who is not completely safe. Other cases, the height requirement unintentionally excludes people who would be safe if the height requirement is for age and maturity reasons. And I'm sure you can imagine little people who are adults with dwarfism, they're not at risk of impulsive juvenile behavior just because their height matches the height of a child. They're not, they don't have immature physiology. When they stand against the measuring stick, they don't qualify, but they're not possessed of those properties that make them an undesirable guest. Adults with bilateral leg amputations or various mobility conditions who can't stand against the measuring stick also would be ruled out because they would not be able to prove that they're taller than the line on the stick. It would be so much simpler and more inclusive for an entire category of patrons than to phrase the requirement as children must be over X centimeters to ride, rather than riders must be over X centimeters to ride. Instead, some operators are developing elaborate computerized models that would create a virtual body for amputees, for instance, to calculate the height of the virtual body, counting or not counting the missing limb segments. Again, if the goal is to exclude riders at risk of juvenile impulsive behavior or immature physiology rather than actual physical size, you don't need computer tools. If a person can show you a driver's license or a beard or a wedding ring, for that matter, it would probably be more than enough to prove that they're an adult and not at risk of juvenile physiology. So what puts operators in that position is a specification by the designer, the manufacturer of the ride, perhaps, that says you must be this tall to ride and says nothing about why. So before we even go beyond height eligibility, we can see that designers need to have a clear rationale for eligibility and to communicate that to the company that buys and operates the ride, because the eligibility requirement just ends up creating very practical problems for the operator. There is a lot more to you must be this blank to ride than just height. It goes on into heart, neck, and back conditions, recent surgery, pregnancy, even diabetes, turning up on ride information signs. The most troubling is the direction not to ride if you have any conditions that may be aggravated by the ride. I can see why the lawyers want to say that, but just the idea that the ride attendant can screen out those guests. It amuses me to think that people without health insurance could go to the carnival and have the ride attendant figure out whether they have a health condition they don't know about. But I digress. I want to look at disabilities. In one project, I sampled a data set of ride manuals. There were some 200 odd ride manuals in a data set that I had. So I collected a sample of 100 manuals from all 57 manufacturers represented in the sample that I took out to look at the eligibility criteria related to disability that were included in the manufacturer's manual for the ride. So as I say, the stratified sample represented all the manufacturers and in proportion to the number of rides they had in the total data set. 50 of the 100 manuals had a restrictive eligibility criteria and that addressed eligibility related to physical or mental disability or condition, but they didn't state criteria that related to the ride experience at all. Most just indiscriminately excluded people considered disabled or impaired or handicapped, or laughable phrases like not in full possession of their physical faculties or simply not in good condition. And those are verbatim phrases from the ride manuals. I put a word cloud on the screen so you can enjoy some of the smaller, flaky ways of phrasing. It's almost as though the designer is providing the owner with an excuse to avoid accepting guests who might require a bit more time to accommodate, knowing that safety regulators will expect the owner to operate the device in accordance with the manufacturer's requirements. So you can see on the graph there that the largest stack on the graph were ones that had an implicit rationale or no rationale and just said the word disabled. So a person could be, have a mental health condition. It could have an amputated limb. It could have a blindness. It could be anything under the disability umbrella, non-specifically all of them not allowed to ride. The second column refers to references to physical disability. So at least it excludes mental conditions. So somebody who was dyslexic would be able to ride if it only restricted physical disabilities. The third column refers to physical condition rather than disability. And then the fourth column, which is surprisingly large, was for mental disability, but it didn't explain anything about what nature of mental disability. Are you excluded because you have depression? Or is it only because you have an impulse control disorder? And I always tend to joke with ride operators, if you want to look at who has an impulse control disorder, you don't need to look for medical diagnoses. I mean, you got a park full of 14-year-olds and every one of them probably has a certain degree of impulse control disorder. So the ride manuals don't provide adequate guidance for the operators for who they should be excluding and why. So if I were to diagram what this implicit process is in the current practice, some designers have perceived the need to protect those guests as a need to list every medical condition under the sun and catalog each of their limitations and requirements, and then cross-reference that against every ride that exists. And that's what I've got diagrammed in the diagram you're seeing on the screen. And as a result of that cross-referencing, it lists the rides suitable for each disability or condition being operated by a particular operator. And these designers would then like to see every disabled patron on arrival at the park report to an intake desk and receive a personal prescription for their day, or even to execute a special waiver agreement to take responsibility and assume all risks. Some of these people have even suggested that patrons pay extra for a tour guide to ensure that they access only the right attractions. There are a lot of impracticalities to those approaches, but I think the one that I will focus on right now is the medical research community. They don't concern themselves with how much G-force a cancer patient can tolerate, or, medical researchers have other priorities. A list of what types of amusement ride forces each condition can tolerate is just not on their radar. Not only that, but the conditions people can have are extremely varied. Within the condition, there's a lot more variety among people with the same condition than between the people with that condition and non-disabled people. So for everything you say that a disabled person cannot do or tolerate, there are more non-disabled people that also can't do or tolerate that thing. And there are also people with that disability that can tolerate or do it just fine, So the idea that a disability is a screening factor for, being on the right or wrong side of the safe exposure line is a fallacy. The personal intake process is also problematic. Some of the most popular parks, can have 50,000 guests a day, and even more on busiest day of the year. Disabled people are 20 to 25% of the population, depending on who's doing the counting. Nobody is getting waivers from 10,000 people a day. It would be the longest line in the park. And as for the personal tour guide or companion, parks do often sell VIP tour packages, and it's just fine if those services can handle groups with an interest in accessibility. You pay the premium, you should get what you want. But it's already expensive to be disabled, while barriers to employment reduce income as well. And it's obvious that guests can't provide free companions to 10,000 people a day. So these approaches are not just impractical, they treat disabled guests as subhuman, unable, and not entitled to self-determination allowed for all other guests. We do not ask a guest if they're pregnant, even if the sign on the ride says this ride is not to be used by pregnant guests, because have you ever gone up to a woman and said, congratulations on your pregnancy, because, there's a risk factor involved with that. We don't have the kind of detailed data we need about each disabled users. But at the same time, we don't know the true abilities of Capricorns or Libras either. And yet we allow people of all astrological signs to ride. So why do we decide disabilities are inherently precarious? The majority of ride operators, the large parks in Florida and also California, have agreements to publish severe injury reports on a quarterly basis. That's part of their special deal with the regulators in those states. And those parks also largely adopt the policy to allow participation by informed self-selection. And the parks are therefore, because of their relationship with the regulator, they're much more motivated to extend access rather than arbitrarily exclude people based on disability. So I used that information to analyze 5 years of publicly reportable serious injuries from Florida parks. And I saw that none of them showed any cases where either physical or cognitive disability was involved. I did see many injuries of older adults, people fainting or tripping and things like that. But we're not restricting old people from riding. We're restricting disabled people as a knee-jerk reaction that disabled people are already broken. We don't want anybody to get off a ride broken, and yet these people come re-broken. What to do? So these parks are rightfully backing away from automatically restricting disability as a broad category. I found another data set of 13 years of fatalities. I'm going to show you the pie chart of this data set. So this is not my data. I found this data from an industry report. It included over 13 years, 51 fatalities documented in association with amusement rides. Just 2 of them involved a patron with a disability. Now, if you look at the pie chart on the right, that's the population prevalence of disability. You notice that the pie chart of disabled people having fatal injuries, the wedge related to disability is smaller than the population prevalence of disability. It suggests that disabled people aren't immune from injury, but it also suggests that as a whole, they're not involved in these serious injuries to a greater degree than non-disabled people. So to this point, I have talked a lot about the problem. And believe me, I could talk even more about the dimensions of the problem and the system that creates the problem, but I'm thinking about who is probably tuning into this First Friday webinar. So I will perhaps turn to talking about what to do, what human factors would do. The human factors approach to making these eligibility assessments would be to break down the interaction of the patrons and the attraction step by step of the ride experience to determine what the rider needs to do at each stage, whether that's to grasp, push, or pull something actively, or whether it's to take up a certain amount of space, whereby not to slide out through a gap. The analysis would also describe step by step what the ride will do to the rider, which identifies what the rider needs to tolerate in terms of the experiences they will feel on the ride. And this analysis can be used in 3 ways. First, we can look at the demands and try to mitigate them, for example, by using automation to make something easier. You see on the model, the section about function allocation. Allocating functions to machinery can reduce the demands of what the person has to meet, and that will increase the number of people able to do the activity. And one of the most obvious examples of allocating a function to a machine is restraints, like lap bars on rides. Lap bars are used on rides sometimes to retain the rider's body to resist ejection forces. We could allocate that function to the person and say, hold on really tight to the edges of the seat. And then if your ride goes over a hill, hold on even tighter, because you could get hurled out otherwise, but we don't. We allocate that function to the restraint device because the restraint device is more reliable and we know how strong it is. We don't know how strong your grip is. So we never allocate the function of retaining your body to resist G-forces. We never allocate that function to the rider. So we could look at all the other things that we allocate to the rider and see whether there's any others of those things that could be allocated to machinery or design of the built ride vehicle or ride experience. Second, we can use the information about the rider mismatch or integration to identify the requirements a person needs to have to do the activity for the purpose of selecting people. And that doesn't mean Capricorns can do it and Libras cannot. It means for this activity, you must be able to do X, Y, or Z, or X, Y, or Z will happen, and you need to be able to tolerate that. The majority of disabled people know their own abilities and tolerance. What they lack is information about what they will need to do or tolerate if they participate in the activity. So this analysis provides the foundation of what we need to communicate to those patrons. Third, we use the information in the analysis to guide what kind of training or information. In this context, we're not training our guests the way we would train employees, but provide information, advisory information to the patrons to be what they need to successfully participate in the activity. So we don't use training, even in a work environment, we don't use training or information to compensate for the wrong kind of person trying to do a badly designed activity. The more training and information and instructions and warnings that come up at this stage of the analysis, the more red flags there are about the design. So those three steps are absolutely in the order of preference in human factors: design, selection, and training. Whether we're talking about military tasking or work design and sophisticated business, but especially in relation to entertainment, like amusement attractions, and I'm sure most other entertainment, you can't put a great deal of weight on training. You want to eliminate the friction to people stepping right up and buying a ticket and becoming a raving fan. You know, we don't want entertainment to feel too much like work. And for the same reason, we want to avoid selection criteria. The best return on investment is to draw your audience from the largest possible market. And obviously, rejecting 25% of the population is a poor strategy for growing your market. But much more than 25% of the population is affected by accessibility, because just one disabled person in a family or friend group can affect the choices of the entire group. And so we're back to design. So at this point, what I think I will do is stop the screen share. And oh yeah, I turn on my video. Okay, here's my video again. So as with recycled height requirements, I do see students recycling the requirements for disabled eligibility when they submit designs to my student competition. Rather than analyzing their own design. They don't use that approach to analyzing their design. They just say, well, this ride is similar to this other ride that already exists in a park. So I will just use the restrictions that they have. And recycling, unfortunately, is common design practice, even from professionals. And it has the potential to perpetuate past discrimination and exclusion. So in my student competition, for instance, I asked them to do a qualifying submission. And if anybody wants to know more about the student competition, we can talk about it during the question and answer at the end. So when I get the open qualifying submissions, I assess them to allocate the invitations to which challenges, you know, and I sit down and I review this large pile of submissions. And as often as not, it goes something like, here is my story coaster design, you know, a roller coaster type of thing that goes through a variety of indoor and outdoor scenery that tells an engaging story. And they go on and say, all riders must have 2 natural legs, at least to the knee, due to the restraint device requirements. Why? Is there a gun to your heads dictating the specific restraint devices? I didn't dictate a specific restraint device. You are designing from a blank page. Or are you only interested in designing new scenery to place around an off-the-shelf roller coaster and abdicating the rest of the design? Do the work. It's 2023. You know, we want you to think of every new thing you do as being maximally inclusive. That doesn't mean that every ride can be appropriate for every person. If a person can't physically tolerate high acceleration, we don't expect that the owner operator would swap out a hyper coaster, like, you know, a big active roller coaster and replace it with a kiddie train so that everyone be able to ride the attraction, whether they can tolerate acceleration or not. People know that in an amusement park, there is going to be roller coasters and things with high acceleration, even if they can't tolerate it themselves. The point is, from the owner-operator's perspective, to have a mix of experiences so that everyone can get a full day's value from their ticket. And in this way, it's a little bit different than theater. You know, if you go to a Macbeth or Hamlet, you don't expect the same experience as if you are going to a musical with lots of song and dance. You decide what kind of theatrical performances you want, but when you go to a theme park or an amusement park, you want the attractions to have something for everyone. And I have faith that people will make the right choice on their own. If A, the nature of the attraction is clear to them, and B, there's a reasonable amount of other experiences available to them within the overall context. We call that in the carnival setting midway balancing, making sure that the midway as a whole has something for everyone. I mean, people with motion sickness or fear of bugs, they abstain from attractions all the time. We don't expect them to register at the nausea nurse or the phobia nurse desk and pay a companion to guide them around to avoid all the spiders and motion sickness triggers. That's a fine model to use. If we do the human factors homework to be able to communicate to the guest what each attraction will be from their perspective, the guest's perspective, and then expect disabled people to make self-interested choices and avoid the things that are disturbing and intolerable to them, because there's plenty of other things they can do instead. Where I thought I would go from here after that point is to wind toward a sort of variation on the theme. And maybe if there are people on the other end, where you are that are in the same space, we can connect afterwards. But one of my interests related to inclusion is related to the proliferation of story-based attractions nowadays, beyond just environmental storytelling. And by this, I mean, we're not just living in a world inhabited by these characters, we're receiving a linear plot by means of expository narration. Where am I in that expository narration? One of the most celebrated attractions of the past 5 years is inhabited by characters, both human and screen-based characters, who speak to guests as if the guests themselves are visiting a particular fictional world where these characters live. And in the fictional world, they're in the midst of a conflict. And so the characters, real people, flesh and blood cast of the attraction, and the video people, but especially the flesh and blood cast of the attraction, they perform their roles realistically. And they urge the guests to do things in service of the story, like hurry up and so forth, and hide and go behind this and do that. They would need to do those if everybody was real people within that world. They're committing to the part. Now, the fact that the pressure is fictional is probably obvious from the narration, but it's not accessible to me. So despite knowing that I'm in a theme park, I find it stressful because I can pick up on the conflict, but I don't know exactly what they're saying. People around me are rushing and sort of playing along with their roles. So I deduce I'm supposed to be hurrying from scene to scene, and some people are doing bad things and get reprimanded. Well, I should say I'm not a fan of the specific intellectual property on which the attraction is based. So I don't bring any prior familiarity with the characters. I can't recognize which of the characters are my friends and which are my foes. I just pick up on the conflict and stress. So bouncing back to human factors analysis, a human factors analysis doesn't just stop at the physical qualifications to safely participate in the experience. It also identifies the knowledge required to do the activity. And this might include the need to recognize symbolic images and character appearances and behavior. And the designer, knowing that the guest needs to understand that, could consider the guests who don't have prior knowledge of the IP to supplement things that the fans would automatically recognize, but the non-fans would not recognize, and provide other forms of conveying that same information or same understanding to the non-fans. So the too long didn't read, TLDR for the story. I see student and professional designers design these exposition-based attractions. And when they think about deaf people at all, they think, oh, I'll put a screen in the ride vehicle with the transcript of the narration. And this is problematic on so many levels. This kind of transcript is rarely clear who is saying what. Even if the transcript is labeled by character name, if I'm not familiar with the property, how do I even know which character is which? Is it transcribed in a language I can read? They made me leave my glasses in the locker. Is the text large enough for me to see in a dim room while I'm going through this attraction? Is the text on the screen long enough to read it and digest it? The owner-operators have spent $1 billion on award-winning ride system, sets, animated figures, and scenery, and they want me to look at a tablet 6 inches from my knee, or they can provide me with transparent caption devices to wear on my nose so that I see captions in line with viewing the world. Nice intention. But normally when I'm not on a Zoom, I wear glasses. And so the caption glasses sit on my nose beyond where my prescription glasses are, where the spaces, you know, like there's a space conflict there. And the text on the caption glasses may not be where my bifocals need it to be. And on a moving ride, the glasses bounce around so that I may not be able to focus on the caption at all in time to read it. So they call it immersive, but it's not. It's an audio book with scenery. Immersive means having the experience have meaning even without words. It would be so easy to have the speaking characters on video at least make universally understood gestures and use body language that conveys the mood, or to embed text cues in the environment that parallel what people are saying. Of course, this is not just about me and other deaf people. In a multicultural world, in a business that caters to international tourism, it's much easier to enjoy entertainment that makes sense without the words. And that's a key point, by the way. There's nothing wrong with spoken performance, either by live actors or screen media, that duplicates what's visibly observable or obvious from the context. In fact, it's necessary for guests who are blind and not deaf. So we can identify those needs in the human factors analysis as well, when we include understand the experience as a performance objective. If understanding requires hearing or requires vision or requires a sense of smell, the analysis can point to places where the gap needs to be closed with a redundancy. Does this mean portable speakers with private voiceovers for blind guests and caption tablets for deaf guests? I prefer not. When we encode the story in multiple layers of the natural design of the attraction, it opens access to more people and enriches the experience for those who have a full spectrum of sensory acuity. They will get a richer experience, while also providing access for the people who at least have one medium to receive the information. It often seems to me that the technology we're using for these accessibility tricks is driven by technology looking for an application sometimes, or an application looking for technology as opposed to a solution. You know, you have a need, let's fix it with technology, and technology is not always the whole answer. Sometimes the answer is not technology. We should be designing for the outcome we need and not so narrowly define the form of solution before we begin. So if we define the solution as to be technology, then that's where we will focus. Disabled designers would almost certainly take a different approach than the current things we're seeing. But where are the disabled designers? I'll give another example from the other end of the sensory spectrum, from replacing information from a sensory channel to another sensory channel to the overall excess of sensory stimuli. Many operators are interested in autistic guests. The chief difference here is that parents are bringing their autistic children to an overstimulating environment and then wanting to not feel embarrassed when their child does what they need to do to manage the sensory overload. To be fair, other guests are often ignorant and fail to differentiate sensory coping strategies from misbehavior. And they actually are judging the parent for the child flapping in the queue. But with the agency of adulthood, autistic adults can choose to abstain from an overwhelming environment or overwhelming parts of an environment, or to engage with it in their own way, to use their own sensory strategies, or to flap without embarrassment. There's no mom nearby saying, stop flapping, people are looking. A lot of sensory friendly features that are recommended in these autism friendly certification schemes, they're just considerate design, like not blasting atmospheric music at top volume, and having dim lights in some places so that everyone who's overwhelmed with sun and other lights can go to a place where it's dim, and not having exclusively automatic flushing toilets that are too loud and catch people by surprise. Many people would make use of those, not just parties with an autistic member, but many people would like that. And the option of a respite is a common element of these sensory friendly packages. But you know, parks already have a sensory respite area, even if they don't have an autism friendly program. They're called table service restaurants. And most table service restaurants have pleasant acoustics and air conditioning and dim lighting, less motion all around, plus food and drink. The price of the meal is the cost of admission to the respite area. If there was a free respite area that offered everything except the food and drink, it would be mobbed because people want respite. That's not a theoretical claim. I refer to a 20-seat credit card holder lounge that used to operate in a park, which never had an empty seat, not just because of the lavish amenities that included air conditioning, 8-ounce bottles of water, and a cookie. Everyone wants respite from the overwhelming crowds. Another common element that is included in these sensory friendly packages is an option to be relieved of the obligation to queue. Again, everyone wants that. And some parks provide the option to avoid queuing at a price of $100 a day or more. But if no one is queuing, everyone is queuing. So we have common available existing solutions to respite and queuing. The question is not whether a person can get those accommodations, but what it costs. There's definitely already a cost of being disabled, and it is no small thing to say you can have what you want, but you have to pay. Every time I turn around, it costs me time and sometimes money to do something that's readily accessible to other people. At the same time, we know that any amenity that disabled people need or would like to have would be exploited by other people who would just like to have it. And operators are nobody's fool. They can impose really complicated procedures to keep a lid on the exploitation thing. I've had students who were inspired by the design challenge for the sensory overwhelm situation to come up with a design to counteract stimulation in the attractions environment. They were trying to build the respite quality into the attractions in some way, which that was their original design intention for their project. And some of these students themselves were neurodivergent. So they were very curious to, as the first step of their project, to explore what the park felt like as an adult designer with an open mind. So they talked to some experienced designers, and the first thing they heard was overstimulation is our product. So that was a different take to what they started with. So buckling up, the students embarked on a multi-day exploration where they did participant observation. And what they actually found, interestingly enough, was that the attractions themselves and even the long queues of the attractions were not actually that problematic or overwhelming. Where they struggled was the space in between attractions. They finished an attraction, where do I go next? The possibilities were endless and they didn't know what they wanted to do next. Is that problematic, or is that just a cue to sit down and have a drink of water? So my take from that experience is to make sure that design teams include neurodivergent designers, multiples, not just one single one, but multiple neurodivergent designers within the design ecosystem, who can in turn connect with others, make sure that the disability input, the neurodivergence input is included in the design process. Do the same with all different abilities, so that the designer community is not designing for them. The designers and users are us. So at that point, Rich, I think I will end my prepared remarks and turn it over to you and the gang for any questions people might have.
Kathryn, thank you so much. So much information you just shared with all of us. And I've got a whole slew of questions that I wrote down as you were talking, but I want to open it up to the group first. If any of the attendees have questions, feel free to type it in the chat or in the question and answer And while we wait for that, one of the first things I wrote down was, as a question, are you aware, Kathryn, of any companies that are right now using this human factors design approach to either design new rides or develop renovations to existing ride experiences?
The best way to answer this is we will never know. I don't know, maybe there's somebody listening in on the webinar that knows the answer to that. But if I were to ask them the question, I don't think anybody would give away their trade secrets.
That's fair.
I would say that based on experiences that I have, it's obvious that it's sometimes been considered. And then it's also obvious sometimes that's not been considered. In terms of how many human factors professionals are working in the industry, there's not very many. But that doesn't mean people who have studied it as a non-major, somebody who has taken courses in it. It doesn't mean that there are not people who have studied some of it. I do include it when I do my presentations to the AIMS and NARSO groups for the operations people. I try to make sure that everybody is aware of human factors. It's really hard to fight against this, the intuitive belief that human factors are problems of users using it wrong. So I try to keep that up, but it's not something that's covered in many engineering programs. It's usually only part of the curriculum in industrial engineering. Other engineering programs tend to just gloss right over it. So that is an issue. It's difficult for operators to get it. But, if you go back to the very beginnings of things that Walt Disney himself did when he was alive and designing and creating his original park concept, you can tell, even though he might not have been a card-carrying human factors professional, you can see the footprints of human factors in what he did.
Interesting. I want to ask you if there are examples of rides that you think approach this problem especially well, but I'm hesitant to ask that question because I don't want to make you call out any particular IP.
You don't want me to single anybody out.
Yeah, in either a good or a bad way. So I won't ask that question, although I might be burning for other folks as well.
Well, I will give you one example because I give this example a lot. I don't know if people are familiar with Skull Island, Reign of Kong. I think it's the name of it, the King Kong ride at Islands of Adventure, Universal's Islands of Adventure. That ride has a lot of icky things that spit guck at people. And it's not everybody's cup of tea. And when people are really frightened, there's a risk that they might, try to self-extract from the ride vehicle and that sort of thing. So the very creative design concept in that ride in the queue, as you're going through the themed queue, there are disgusting, gucky things that spit and are covered with slime in the queue. So that if a person really is uncomfortable, they're going to feel uncomfortable early enough to exit by the chicken exit, rather than getting all the way onto the ride vehicle halfway through the ride and then having a sluggy, disgusting thing spit at them. So I think that sort of foreshadowing is a really powerful design tool. Theater people like dramaturgists, people who are creating stories, they're always foreshadowing, right? Borrow that technique into attraction design. And you can help people make prudent decisions for themselves, especially when it comes to, that intangibles of what you will feel.
I love that example because the next thing I wrote was you talked about informing potential patrons about what they'll need to be able to do and or tolerate before they get to the ride. And I wanted to ask, do you think that's a good way to do that, sort of as in that now much more narrative space of the queue, of the line? Can that be incorporated into that experience so that potential participants can go, oh, this is a thing I'm not interested in? Clearly, you think that's a good idea.
Yeah, so I know that the creatives and the marketing people also hate the idea of spoilers. So I know that is always a pressure on in this context. People don't want to have spoilers. But at the same time, if there's a spider on the ride, he can have it. I am not cohabiting this ride with a spider. So if I go to guest services and I say, are there spiders on the ride? I don't want them to say, oh, wait and see, it'll be great. Like, I want them to say yes or no. If I'm asking you about spiders, I really need to know. So I think that we need to differentiate what goes on the warning sign and what somebody gets when they ask a question. If somebody asks a team member or cast member and the team member or cast member isn't sure what they can say, what they can always say is, pardon me, wait here, I will get my lead. And then bring a lead in who can answer the question, who knows what they can say and what they can't say. So, you know, the needs of a person who is actively seeking information should never be a problem. What goes on the warning sign? There was one sign, dinosaur in Disney's Animal Kingdom, where the biggest text on the warning sign is not something like no hats and put your phone away. It's loud noises and scary dinosaurs. Because, you know, that's the most important thing you need to know. If you can't tolerate loud noises, this is not your place. So I think that there are ways that designers can easily build it both in a textual level on the warning sign itself, in the operation level, as well as in the cue and the environmental storytelling. So I think it is possible. It just requires the designers to challenge themselves. If we say, okay, we're going to let people make their own self-informed decisions, how can we make sure that they're informed? Use every medium in our arsenal. And so this themed entertainment has so many media in its arsenal. We should use all of them, not just the warning sign, not just the brochure, not just the website, but, you know, the attraction itself and the land that the attraction is in.
That's great. Thank you. A question that's come up in the question and answer. I know, Brandon, you have some questions too. I'll make sure we give you some time for that. But a question that's come up in the question and answer. It's an anonymous question. It says, thank you for your presentation. I've noticed immersive entertainment becoming more of a part of many different markets, including children's healthcare. And they're asking if you have any knowledge of or experience of that design work in this sector, and any feedback on the inclusivity there that you might have from that.
So can you repeat or rephrase the question? I'm not sure. I might say something irrelevant if I don't ask you to redo it.
Sure. They're asking, it appears that they're asking about how and whether inclusivity is being considered in the use of immersive narrative entertainment in other fields like healthcare, which seems to be more prevalent in like children's healthcare.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of people who are saying, well, the theme park is our model, but we have gas stations, which are now themed destinations, right? Even CNN covered the Buc-ee's phenomenon. So people are realizing that immersion or, you know, a full-on commitment to a theme is a good way to keep your guests, you know, engaged, whether it's healthcare or whether it's, you know, a club environment or whether, you know, restaurant or retail. You know, the Aber zombies are hanging out at their store with the smells and the theming, you know, so retail. I think that that the whole Disneyization of the world, it goes beyond just theme parks. So whether it's a healthcare facility, I think that all of these concepts are relevant. I think those environments where it's like a clinical context or an educational environment, I think that they're more likely to already have things that they're doing in that regard, and now they're just enhancing and adding story to it. The one thing that always sits in me is the child versus adult thing. So when we're thinking about children doing things for children, disabled people grow up and don't become able-bodied when they hit 18, you know, but people stop thinking of them. People only think about disabled people in the context of a theme park or an amusement park as children. So, you know, the clinical setting, if you have a children's hospital and you want to have a themed environment, good. Where is that in the cancer hospital for adults? End of life care, where is that? So why are we always thinking of children when we are thinking about inclusion and access? So that's sort of like yes, and to that question.
Thank you for that. Brandon, do you have a question or two that you want to throw out there?
Yeah, I was really interested before we met, Kathryn, and then after we did, for you to share the Thrill event that you put on, that activity, the connectivity with students, and just experiential learning as a whole. You know, tell us a little bit about Thrill so that others learn of it, and then your interactions with students and how you support the experiential learning side of things.
Okay, sure. I will go back to sort of ground zero with the competition, because to give it a little context, in about 2013, 2014, we had a student club and they were getting involved with IAAPA and ASTM and some other organizations, but they wanted to, enhance their experience. So we set up a little competition that we held in Toronto, and we had 4 teams, and we brought in some industry judges as feedback panel, and it was a lot of fun. And then the next year I was on my sabbatical, and Steve Blum from Universal Creative asked me if I would consider repeating the competition, but doing it in Orlando under the Universal Creative sponsorship. And I thought that sounded like a great idea. So starting in 2016, we did that, and we have done it with their sponsorship ever since, with a little bit of a glitch because of the whole worldwide, So we are now up to 19 teams that participate in it. And we do it just prior to IAAPA, because people who are out of town sometimes come to town because of IAAPA, to make it convenient for the professionals to participate as jury members for the competition. Because we have so many teams and there's only so much airtime for presentations, I now have to screen the teams for invitations, for the invitational. So in the springtime, in about March-ish, I want to say, we send out invitations to schools that we have contact people for. So if anybody out there is from a school that is not currently participating, make sure I have a contact information, preferably from the club contact person. We send that information out for them to register for the open qualifying competition. And in the open qualifying competition, they do one single design that demonstrates the kind of skill sets they hope for invitations related to. And we like teams to have multidisciplinary composition, because the idea is not to have a fantasy camp where engineers are doing interior design and interior design architects are doing business decisions. Like, we bring in teams, hopefully they will have hospitality and tourism members, artistic and creative architecture, interiors, theater people, and also engineering and technical science people. So they do their open qualifying, and I allocate the invitations to them in like July-ish. And then in August, they pull their teams together sometimes, as they come back to school. Some schools start the school year later. So we struggle to get it in by Labor Day. We want to make sure that we can get our hotel commitments, handled and all that sort of thing, because we're all away from home in that environment. So we can't just, run over and add another room. So we hope to get all that settled in September. And then in October, we have some preparatory webinars, so the students can meet me and get to hear about what they will experience, because a lot of them are doing it for the first time. When they fly to Orlando or drive to Orlando the Wednesday before IAAPA, they check in, and we do a mixer warm-up meet and greet thing. Thursday morning, the competition begins. We have a park walk where they see a bunch of stuff for whatever reason, and then they come back, have lunch, and they get the challenges at that moment. So the very next day, some challenges are presented, so they have very little time to present. Obviously, we're not looking for people to do like bill of materials and costing breakdowns and like full engineering analysis. And our take on this, and Universal's agreement on this whole why they like this competition, is that any competent graduate can do that kind of stuff. But do you have that initial creativity to understand what a problem is and figure that stuff out? So that's where the focus is on that blue sky aspect of, when I ask you to do this thing, what is your go-to? If your go-to is shopping, I'm going to buy a ride from Zamperla, I'm going to buy a ride from Intimate. Or is your concept, I want people to move in this way, and this is how I'm going to make them move in that way? So we want to see what the innate abilities So we've had about 600 alumni from the competition over the years, and about 15% of them have worked at Universal at some point since they competed. And I'm sure a lot of them have worked for the other place and also for manufacturers and suppliers in the industry as well. So it's been pretty good as it's not so much experiential learning as it is an audition rather than an interview, you know. So they get a chance to do a work sample. And so it's not just individual, it's also team. How do you respect your teammates? How do you work well with other professions? How do you answer questions from very accomplished professionals who are, you know, on the juries asking you questions? Can you think on your feet and all that sort of thing? So it's a really, really interesting thing to see. I think my favorite thing from the competition is when the students have finished presenting and they have left the room and the jury remains, watching all the professionals in the jury. It's almost like they're back in fourth year doing a group project again, and they're like, oh, what would I do with this challenge? And oh, did you see what that guy did? Did you see what that kid did? So it's really interesting to see how they relate to the challenges. So it validates, I think, what the experience is rather than a soup to nuts kind of design project where they have to come all the way to a working model and, you know, shop drawings and all that sort of stuff. Again, I think any competent graduate can eventually do that. But are you creative? That's something that we need to know.
I can't think of a better advertisement for that competition than all that you just said. And that brings us perfectly to a close here at 1 o'clock. There were a couple of other folks who had asked some questions. I'll follow up with Kathryn to see if I can get those to her and then maybe put you folks in touch. I wish we had more time. I have lots of questions about captioning and narrative inclusion of folks who don't have the same hearing capabilities. So I may follow up with you on that separately. It's a thing that we're trying to figure out in our Department of Theater at Purdue. So Kathryn, thank you so much. This was wonderful, really informative, really exciting. I'll let everybody who's still here know that our next First Friday in November, I don't have the date in front of me, my apologies. That will be a conversation with folks from Sky Elements Drones. They're going to be talking about their experiential learning experience with students at Purdue University, developing a drone performance for the first-year students in the Boiler Gold Rush orientation project this year, where they put together a drone show with students of about 300 light-up drones. And then later in December, the first Friday in December, will be a conversation about the ethics of AI in the entertainment industry with a philosophy faculty member in the ethics of AI program here at Purdue, and with a researcher in the entertainment industry looking at how AI is being used in the industry. So please keep your eyes open for that information. Thank you all so much. Kathryn, again, thank you for being here. Brandon, of course, thank you. And we will see you all soon. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you for having me.